The wind was a razor slicing across the high, barren escarpment. It tore at the thin fabric of her dress, the one she'd mended a dozen times, the one they'd barely let her keep. Below, the jagged rocks waited, indifferent. Amina didn't scream when their hands, rough and calloused, shoved her. There was no sound in her, only a cold, hollowing dread that had been her companion for weeks. The air rushed past, a roaring silence, and then the impact, a brutal, splintering pain that stole her breath before the darkness took her. She landed not on the lethal spires of rock but on a steep, forgiving slope of scree and resilient mountain brush, tumbling, scraping, until a thorny thicket snagged her torn dress, holding her suspended on the lip of oblivion. The sky above was a cold, bruised purple, like an old wound. She lay there, a broken doll, the world a dizzying smear. Consciousness was a flickering candle, threatening to extinguish with every gust of wind that whispered of the mayor's decree, his voice smooth as polished stone, deadly as a coiled viper. He had wanted her compliance, her silence, her body. She had offered only a locked gaze, a refusal as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. This was her reward. Elias found her near dusk. He'd been tracking a wounded buck, a creature of instinct and pain, much like the heap of torn cloth and bruised flesh he nearly stumbled over. The buck was forgotten. He knelt, his large, weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed dirt and blood-matted hair from a face frozen in a mask of silent terror. Her eyes, when they flickered open, were wide, animalistic, reflecting the dying light and a horror too deep for tears. He saw the marks on her, the geography of cruelty etched into her skin. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy tools, useless for this kind of damage. He had learned that long ago, in another life, when words had failed to save Sarah, failed to save his boy. He gathered her into his arms, her body light as a starved bird. The ascent back up the treacherous slope, then the long, slow ride to his isolated ranch, was a penance he hadn't known he was seeking. She was unconscious for most of it, a dead weight that felt heavier than any stone, heavier than memory. He laid her on the simple cot in the small spare room, the one that had been empty for a decade, its emptiness a constant, dull ache in his chest. He cleaned her wounds with water warmed on the stove, his movements economical, precise. He stitched the deeper gashes with a practiced hand, the kind that mended leather harnesses and sutured livestock. He left a tin cup of water and a piece of dried jerky on the small crate beside the cot. Then he sat in his worn chair by the cold hearth, the rifle across his knees, and watched the doorway, listening to the ragged sound of her breathing, a fragile counterpoint to the howling wind. The wind knew. It always knew. Amina woke to pain, sharp and insistent, and the smell of dust, old wood, and something faintly medicinal. Fear, cold and immediate, coiled in her stomach. She was alive. A miracle she hadn't dared pray for. Her body screamed with every tiny movement. Slowly, carefully, she pieced together the fragments, the fall, the darkness, then a sensation of being carried, the rhythmic sway, the scent of horse and worn leather. She remembered a face, weathered, unreadable, eyes like chips of winter ice. He had not hurt her. Not yet. The room was small, sparse. A single window, covered with a piece of oiled parchment, let in a muted, grey light. The door was closed. She listened. Silence, deep and profound, broken only by the crackle of a distant fire and the sigh of wind around the cabin walls. She was a prisoner, then. Just a different kind. The water was still there, the jerky untouched. Her throat was a desert. With trembling hands, she reached for the cup, each movement an agony. The water was cool, shocking against her parched tongue. She drank slowly, rationing it, her gaze fixed on the door. He would come back. Men always came back. The mayor, with his soft hands and rotten soul, had taught her that. They took what they wanted. She braced herself, a small, wounded animal, ready to fight, to bite, to claw, even if it was the last thing she did. Hours passed. The light outside shifted, faded. No one came. The silence pressed in, heavy as a shroud, yet strangely, not as terrifying as the noise of the town, the leering eyes, the whispered condemnations. Here, there was only the wind, the creak of the cabin, the distant, mournful call of a coyote. And him. Somewhere outside that door. Waiting. Or perhaps, simply existing, as silent and enduring as the mountains that ringed this desolate place. He moved with the quiet rhythm of the land itself. Elias. She learned his name not from speech, but from a faded brand on a saddle blanket she glimpsed when he brought in fresh firewood. His days were a pattern of hard work, a silent conversation with the earth and his few animals. He would leave food outside her door, a bowl of thin stew, a hunk of dark bread, sometimes a piece of dried fruit, a rare treasure. He never tried the door, never intruded. He mended the roof where the wind had loosened shingles, his hammer blows distant, rhythmic. He chopped wood, the axe falling with a steady, metronomic beat. He tended his horses, his low murmurs to them the only sound she heard from him, soft and rough like smoothed stone. Amina watched him through a tiny crack in the wooden shutter she dared to open when she was sure he was far enough away. She saw the way he moved, economical, powerful, a man shaped by solitude and labor. His face, in the harsh light of the high plains, was a map of unspoken sorrows. There were lines etched around his eyes, not just from sun, but from a grief that had settled deep in his bones. She recognized it. Shame still clung to her like the dust of the cliff face, a gritty residue she couldn't wash away. The mayor's touch, his words, were a brand on her soul. But here, in this silence, a tiny, fragile seed of something other than fear began to stir. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was curiosity. An dawning awareness that this man's silence was different. It wasn't the silence of condemnation, but of space. He was giving her space to breathe, to heal, to simply be. One morning, she found her dress, the one torn to shreds by her fall, lying folded outside her door. It was clean, meticulously mended. The stitches were neat, small, almost invisible, a stark contrast to his calloused, working hands. Beside it lay a bar of harsh lye soap and a rough-spun towel. He had asked nothing, demanded nothing. He simply provided. That day, Amina pushed the door open a few inches. The main room of the cabin was simple, utilitarian. A stone hearth, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs. He was at the table, mending a leather strap, his back to her. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence, though she knew he was aware of her, every nerve in her own body screamed it. She stood there for a long moment, trembling, then retreated, pulling the door almost closed. A small victory. A terrifying one. The next day, she left the empty bowl outside her door, a silent acknowledgement. When he brought her meal that evening, he paused, his gaze resting on the bowl for a moment before he picked it up. He still didn't look at her, didn't speak. But something had shifted, an invisible thread spun between them in the vast, echoing silence. He began leaving the cabin door slightly ajar when he worked nearby, a subtle invitation, or perhaps just a statement that she was not a prisoner. She started to venture out, just a few steps from her room, when he was occupied with the horses or chopping wood further away. The air, though cold, felt clean, sharp. The vastness of the landscape, which had initially terrified her, began to feel like a shield. Here, the mayor's suffocating presence couldn't reach. Here, the judging eyes of the town were distant, unseen. There was only the wind, the earth, and the silent man who had pulled her back from the edge. Slowly, painstakingly, Amina began to reclaim small pieces of herself. The physical pain dulled, replaced by a deep, aching weariness, but her wounds were healing. The raw abrasion scabbed over, the bruises faded from angry purple to mottled yellow-green. She started to care for her small room, sweeping the dust with a makeshift broom of twigs, arranging the few items with a strange, fierce possessiveness. This small space was hers. He brought her a pail of water each morning, warm from the stove, and left it by her door. One day, she found a small, chipped mirror propped against it. Her reflection was a shock, gaunt, haunted, but undeniably alive. The eyes that stared back were no longer just animalistic with fear, a flicker of something else lay deep within them, a stubborn ember. She began to mend her own clothes, using a needle and thread she found in a small tin he left on the table, the stitches clumsy at first, then surer. It was an echo of his own act of mending her dress, a silent conversation in thread and fabric. She found a discarded piece of charcoal and, on a smooth piece of bark, began to draw. Simple shapes at first, the outline of the mountains, the gnarled form of a dead tree. Then, more daringly, a bird in flight, a running horse. She left the drawings where he might see them, not as a gift, but as a statement, I am here. I see. I remember. Elias noticed. He noticed everything. The subtle shift in her posture when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she no longer flinched at every unexpected sound. He saw the drawings, the fierce, delicate lines. They reminded him of Sarah, of her quiet ways of making beauty in a harsh world. The memory was a dull ache, no longer the razor edge it once had been. Amina's presence had unknowingly begun to fill the hollow spaces in his life, not replacing what was lost, but creating something new, fragile, and unnamed. He never commented on the drawings, never acknowledged them directly, but he started leaving smoother pieces of bark and more charcoal sticks where she could find them. One afternoon, while he was splitting logs, the axe head worked loose. He swore, a low, guttural sound, rare for him. Amina, who had been watching from the shadowed doorway of her room, took an involuntary step forward. He looked up, surprised, met her eyes for a fleeting second. She froze, then retreated. But the next day, when he picked up the axe, the head had been expertly wedged and tightened. He ran his thumb over the smooth, secure fit. He knew it was her. He thought of his wife, her small, capable hands that could fix anything. He didn't speak of it. There was no need. The silent language between them grew richer, more nuanced. She started to help, in small, almost imperceptible ways. If he left a tool out, she would return it to its place on the wall. If a bucket of water was low, she would take it to the well, her movements still hesitant but purposeful. She began to eat at the far end of the main table, her back to the wall, while he ate at his usual spot. The silence was still there, vast and deep, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding, with the quiet rhythm of two damaged souls learning to share the same small space, the same fragile peace. The world outside the ranch, however, did not forget. Once a month, Elias made the long ride to the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town, a place he avoided unless necessity drove him. It was a journey into a landscape of hushed whispers and averted gazes. Mayor Thompson's influence was a blight on the region, his power absolute, his cruelty a constant, unspoken threat. On one such trip, as Elias bartered for flour and salt, he heard the talk. A girl, a dark-skinned outsider, had defied the mayor. She had vanished. Thrown from the cliffs, some said, a fitting end for her insolence. Others whispered she'd run off, a wild thing returning to the wilderness. No one mourned her. No one questioned the mayor. Elias listened, his face impassive, his eyes cold slate. He bought his supplies, his words few, his presence a silent rebuke to their cowardice. But the news unsettled him. The mayor was not a man to let a slight go unanswered, a loose end untied. He would want confirmation. He would want to ensure his authority remained absolute. That evening, back at the ranch, the silence felt heavier, charged with a new tension. Amina sensed it in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze lingered a little longer on the darkening horizon. She saw him clean his rifle with slow, deliberate movements, his jaw tight. Fear, a familiar cold serpent, uncalled in her belly. The sanctuary, their carefully constructed haven of silence and shared tasks, felt suddenly fragile, exposed. The wind, that night, carried a different tune. It wasn't the lonely sigh of the plains, it was a warning, a harbinger of the storm gathering on the edges of their secluded world. The town was stirring. And the mayor had a long memory. The riders came a week later, 3 of them, silhouetted against the stark morning sun. They weren't townsfolk, they were Thompson's men, the kind who did his dirty work with a casual, brutal efficiency. Elias had been expecting them. He met them in the yard, his stance relaxed but ready, his old shotgun leaning casually against the porch rail, within easy reach. Amina watched from the deepest shadow of her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could hear the low murmur of voices, Elias's responses curt, laconic. Then, a harsher tone, one of the men, demanding. "We heard you took in a stray rancher. A dark girl. Matches the description of one who caused some trouble for Mayor Thompson." Elias didn't move. "Only strays I got are four-legged. And they mind their own business." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but carried the weight of the mountains behind him. Another voice, smoother, more menacing. "The mayor don't like loose ends, old man. He pays well for information. Even better for cooperation." Amina pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. This was it. The end of the fragile peace. They would take her. Or him. Or both. She saw Elias shift his weight slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Nothing to cooperate with. Now, you're on private land. Best you be moving on." There was a tense silence, the wind whistling through the eaves the only sound. Then, the jingle of harnesses, the thud of hooves as the men reluctantly turned their horses. One of them spat on the ground near Elias's feet. "You'll regret this, old-timer." "The mayor always gets what he wants." They rode off, their threat hanging heavy in the air. Elias didn't come inside immediately. He stood watching them go, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. When he finally entered the cabin, his face was grim. He looked towards her room, a question in his eyes, though he didn't speak it. Amina knew. She knew the sanctuary was breached. The fear was a living thing inside her, choking, paralyzing. But something else was there too, a tiny, fierce spark of defiance she hadn't known she possessed. It was born of the mended dress, the shared silence, the drawings on bark, the tightened axe head. It was born of his quiet, unwavering protection. He had stood against them for her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind seemed to whisper the mayor's name, the rider's threats. She thought of the cliff, the fall, the endless darkness. She thought of Elias, his silent strength, the unspoken kindness that had been her lifeline. He was in danger because of her. The realization was a cold stone in her gut. Sometime before dawn, she made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding. She couldn't let him face this alone. She got up, dressed in the mended clothes, her movements no longer hesitant but imbued with a strange, new resolve. She walked into the main room. Elias was asleep in his chair by the cold hearth, the shotgun still across his lap, his face etched with weariness even in sleep. She stood looking at him for a long moment. Then, she reached out and gently touched his arm. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert. He saw her standing there, fully dressed, her face pale but resolute in the pre-dawn gloom. For the first time, she met his gaze directly, holding it. And then, she spoke. Her voice was raspy from disuse, barely a whisper, but clear. "They will come back." He simply nodded, his eyes searching hers. "I will not hide," she said, louder this time, the words gaining strength as they left her lips. "I will not let them take you." Another nod. Then, a flicker of something in his eyes, something akin to surprise, and perhaps, a deep, weary respect. He had pulled her from the precipice of death. Now, it seemed, she was ready to stand beside him, to face whatever came, her voice, once stolen, now a fragile weapon against the encroaching darkness. The confrontation came sooner than they expected, not with the stealth of hired thugs, but with the brazen arrogance of power. Mayor Thompson himself rode into the yard, flanked by a dozen men, some his enforcers, others townsfolk, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and grim righteousness. It was mid-morning, the sun high and unforgiving, stripping away all shadows, all pretense. Elias and Amina stood on the porch, side by side. He, with his shotgun held loosely at his side, she, with nothing but the newfound strength in her spine and the clarity in her eyes. The mayor, a portly man whose expensive clothes couldn't hide the rot within, smirked. "Well, well. Look what the old hermit dragged in. I heard rumors, but I confess, I didn't think even you were foolish enough to harbor a fugitive." Elias, his voice was oily, condescending. Elias didn't answer, his gaze fixed on Thompson. It was Amina who spoke, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent yard. "I am no fugitive, Mayor Thompson. I am the woman you tried to murder." A murmur rippled through the assembled townsfolk. Some shifted uncomfortably. Thompson's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, uglier. "Murder?" Such dramatic words from a lying little thing. "You fell. A tragic accident. After your hysterics." Amina stepped forward, a single, defiant step. "I did not fall. Your men threw me from the cliff because I refused you. Because I would not be another of your possessions." Her words were plain, unadorned, but they struck with the force of truth. She looked directly at the townsfolk. "He told you I was insolent, a troublemaker. He tells you what he wants you to believe. How many others has he silenced? How many injustices have you ignored, out of fear or convenience?" The mayor's face darkened with rage. "Enough of this slander. Seize her. And you, old man, you'll pay for obstructing justice." His men hesitated, looking from the mayor to Elias, whose quiet stillness was more menacing than any bluster. Elias raised his shotgun slightly. "This is my land. She is under my protection." His voice was low, a rumble of distant thunder. "Protection?" Thompson laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "What can one old man and a broken girl do against me? Against the town?" "We are not broken," Amina said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "And perhaps the town is not as blind as you believe." She saw a flicker of doubt in some of the faces in the crowd, a reluctant shame. Old man Hemlock, who ran the general store, shifted his feet, avoiding her gaze. Martha Periwinkle, whose daughter had left town under a cloud of unspoken rumors concerning the mayor, pressed her lips into a thin line. "You prey on the weak, Mayor Thompson," Amina continued, her voice gaining power. "You use your position to threaten and to take. But your power is built on our silence. And I will not be silent anymore." She detailed his propositions, his threats, the cold calculation in his eyes as he ordered her death. She spoke not with hysteria, but with a chilling, factual calm that was more damning than any accusation. The wind picked up, swirling dust around their feet, as if the land itself was listening. Elias remained a steadfast presence beside her, his silence a powerful endorsement of her words. He didn't need to speak, his loyalty, his protection, was her shield. The mayor, seeing his authority challenged, his narrative unraveling, began to bluster. "Lies. All lies? She's a manipulative witch, trying to save her own skin." But his words lacked conviction. The seed of doubt Amina had planted was taking root. Then, a voice from the crowd, hesitant but clear. It was young Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice. "My sister, she said things about the mayor too." Before she left, the stone dropped into a silent pond. Others murmured agreement, hushed stories of past aggressions, of fear and intimidation. The mayor's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His men looked uneasy, their loyalty wavering. The power was shifting, not with violence, but with the undeniable weight of truth. Thompson, his face contorted in a mask of fury and desperation, lunged towards Amina. "You little liar! I'll silence you myself." Before he could take 2 steps, Elias moved, not with the shotgun, but with a speed that belied his age, blocking Thompson's path, his armor steel bar. Enough. The word was quiet, final. The mayor, confronted by Elias's unyielding strength and the suddenly mutinous faces of the townsfolk, faltered. His rage deflated, leaving behind a pathetic, sputtering wreck. His reign of fear was over, broken not by a gun, but by a young woman's courage and an old man's quiet defiance. The townsfolk began to disperse, some in shame, some in quiet relief, leaving Thompson alone and exposed in the dusty yard, his power evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Elias and Amina watched them go. Then, he turned to her, his eyes, for the first time, holding a hint of something that looked like a weary smile. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the vast silence of the high plains, a new peace had been forged, not of solitude, but of shared strength, a defiant sanctuary built on truth and courage. The wind whispered their names, no longer a lament, but a song of survival, of a found family, of a hard-won, unbreakable peace. The cabin behind them, once a refuge for one broken soul, now held two, mended and whole, under the vast, watchful sky.